Hello and welcome to our discussion of divine command theory. Now, divine command theory is a very kind of early form of ethical thought that still seems somewhat popular today with many individuals. In essence, we're going to be looking at the connection between ethics and religion, or morality and religion, a little bit in this unit. Now, many individuals believe that there is a very robust connection between ethics and religion. And in fact, some people believe that we can't even be ethical without religion. Now, there's a number of different studies and obviously a number of different ethical theories which would significantly contradict that. But for some individuals, and for many people who believe very strongly in divine commands as being a motivator for ethics or a basis for ethics, they'd argue that those other forms of thinking are immoral. Now, it's very curious, and in one of the recommended articles that you have for this reading, you see that Peter and his research colleague were able to determine that people who identified as being religious in their kind of ethical orientation versus individuals who were defined in more secular ways, for the most part, answered scenarios about various ethical dilemmas in the same way. So it may be a challenge to individuals who believe that divine commands are required, or that religion is required for morality. Now, divine command theory is perhaps the most general form of religious-based ethics. So let's take a look at the structure of it. Our theory of the right is going to primarily relate to divine commands. That is, that God is going to be the sole entity that gives us moral action. That is, that God says things are right or that things are wrong. And that God is the only way how things can be defined as right or wrong. So a very common example of this in Abrahamic religion, for example, can be found in the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, things such as thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and so forth, are examples of divine commands, whereby God has given us right actions. Optional actions would be clearly actions that are not necessarily commanded by God. Wrong actions would be actions that are strictly prohibited by God. So, for example, many individuals within the Judaic and Christian traditions believe that the Bible is a guide or maybe even a literal recitation of God's words. And so they may look at things such as the Book of the Covenant, for example, which is commonly Leviticus, to give us many guidelines for prohibitions. So prohibitions such as you shouldn't keep your meat and dairy in the same freezer, for example, that many Orthodox Jews end up with upholding come from this. Many individuals within the Christian tradition also utilize both Old Testament and New Testament to help justify their conceptions of right action and wrong action. Our theory of the good relates solely to the questions of divinity. That is, the divine, or God, is seen as being intrinsically good. God is the only thing that can create intrinsic worth. So things that are intrinsically worthy are worthy only by virtue of God. We actually may say more appropriately that they have extrinsic value, than necessarily having intrinsic good. That God is the only intrinsic good. That everything else is good because God has said it's good. That's where our conception of non-moral value comes in. That is, that things are good only because God says they are. Our conception of moral value, that is whether or not a person can be praised or blamed for their actions, comes from the idea that they're acting out of a motive of love for fulfilling the commands of God. A person who, for example, is fulfilling a command due to fear is usually valued differently in terms of moral responsibility, praiseworthiness, and blameworthiness than a person who's acting out of love. Gell tells us that our theory of the right states that an action is obligatory if and only if God commands that we perform the action. Our theory of the good, God's will is the sole criteria that makes something good or bad. It seems pretty basic. Now, for some pretty awesome examples of this, check out this scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I ask you to count how many divine commands you actually hear within this small phrase, this small area. It's pretty great. Now, why in our modern society would we consider possibly continuing to use divine command theory? Well, Mortimer, for example, provides us with a fairly robust defense. According to Mortimer, divine commands end up providing us with norms and standards for human behavior. So if we consider, for example, that God's commands are universal in nature, then they'll end up providing us with a way of judging what human behavior should look like. Again, the Ten Commandments is something that many people may appeal to. Second, divine commands may give us, the divine command theory that is, may give us evidence for helping us understand the proper spirit for following God's commands. Timmons writes, ideally, humans are to strive towards holiness by following God's commands, not out of fear or self-interest, but out of love for God. Because the moral goodness of persons has to do with their motives, this point about the spirit of morality presumably reveals the divine command theory's account of moral goodness. The moral goodness, and hence moral virtue, of individuals is measured by how closely they come to fulfilling God's commands out of the motive of love of God. And lastly, divine command theory, according to Mortimer, can help provide us with revelations about new standards for values, so that we can get some idea about what moral concepts should be through divine revelation or biblical revelation. Now, this may sound like it's working pretty well, and then we hit the Socratic challenge. Socrates, a figure that we're going to come across a few times this semester, provided a challenge to divine command theory in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro. This may be a remarkably powerful challenge. Socrates says, "You said, I think, that there is one characteristic which makes all pious actions pious, and another characteristic that makes all impious actions impious." Euthyphro responds back, "Well, I should say that piety is what all the gods love, and that impiety is what they all hate." Socrates then asks, "Now consider this question. Do the gods love piety because it is pious, or is it pious because they love it?" This simple exchange may throw the theory on its head. We can ask the same question with regards to morality and divine commands. That is, does God command that we do things because they are obligatory? Or are they some action obligatory because God commands that we do it? So the question of where we actually place obligation, is it because the actions are obligatory in themselves, or are they obligatory only because God has said they are? It's critical. And it's critical for one simple reason. Because of what we call the O3 conception of God. Within Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's a traditional conception of God that says that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. That is, that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. Now, the Euthyphro dilemma may lead us to challenge this. Because it states, ultimately, we have to look at these two options. What is right either depends on God's commands in the sense that those commands that are what makes actions right or wrong. So again, that we place the obligatory nature in the command, or that God commands us to perform or refrain from certain actions because there is something about them which is right or wrong. And being omniscient and omnibenevolent, all commands conform to divine knowledge? Well, the first option is divine command theory. The second option, however, represents a rejection of divine command theory because it tells us that there is something independent from God that gives us obligatory action. That is, it tells us that certain actions are right or wrong. This may end up further challenging the theory. If we accept that our second option is true, then God is not omniscient as the commands are arbitrary. That is, that there is no consideration for reason behind any of the commands. So if God says for us to do something or not to do something, there's no power there because the obligatory nature of the command or the action is in the action itself, not in what God said. As Timmons writes, he has no reason for commanding that we keep our promises and avoid hurting others. He might just as well have commanded us to ignore our promises and to ignore how our actions affect others. Well, our second factor here brings us to the question of omnibenevolence. If we can't make sense of God's sense of goodness, then we're forced to abandon the concept of omnibenevolence. Timmons writes, consider the claim that God is good. According to the divine command theory, something S is good if and only if God commands that we bring about or preserve S. Accordingly, God is good if and only if God commands that we bring about and preserve Him. And not just because it is nonsense to talk about human beings bringing about or preserving an all-sufficient being. God is good in virtue of possessing certain characteristics, not as a result of commands He issues. Since the divine command theory forces the theist to give up God's rationality, as well as perfect moral goodness, the theist has a reason to possibly reject the theory. By basing our conception of morality on a particular entity or divinity, we're left to this challenge. So this forces us to ask questions. Can we save this O3 God? Well, one way to do this is to try to maybe understand omnipotence differently. Now, omnipotence, remember, being all-powerful. There are two things we could do. We could say that right, wrong, good, bad depends on God's creativity, on God's choices. Or we could say, perhaps, that basic facts about right or wrong are independent of God's commands. Now, if they're independent of God's commands, we may be able to say something along the line of that there are certain conditions of the world that maybe were created by God that are outside of those commands. That is, that exist outside of it, in the sense that they don't derive from it. We can also try to understand that actions may be wrong because of their effects on well-being. That is, we may be able to say that an action is wrong because of some other criteria. If God created a certain environment and a certain human nature, or a certain condition of our existence, then actions could be wrong because they go contrary to that. So, for example, the fact that we are mortal as opposed to immortal may make things such as killing wrong. In that sense, God has control over what moral rules apply to us because God creates that condition, creates that nature, and therefore has power over right, wrong, good, bad. Now, this is a kind of an unusual reinterpretation of omnipotence, but for the theist, it may do it. We can also look at the question of necessity. Now, necessity involves logic here. And so, for example, can God make an unmovable rock? Or can God make 2 plus 2 equals 5? Well, it may be possible that we can argue that omnipotence has to be constrained by logic. That God, even with unlimited power, couldn't do these things because these things are contradictory. That is, you can't make an immovable rock if you're God. Power simply doesn't exist that way. If that's the case, the fact that God cannot do or bring about the impossible is actually not a limit on God's omnipotence. We may be able to therefore say that there's not a real limit on God's omnipotence, that the truth of the principles that may be involved here do not rely on God's will. Timmons writes, if we reconsider the claim about God as creator, we should reformulate it to say, as omnipotent, God has power over everything that is not a matter of necessity. In particular, God is creator of the entire physical universe, including human beings, whose existence is certainly not a necessary fact. Now, these are some pretty interesting kind of dodges to the question of Euthyphro. Answering Euthyphro is something that the theory ultimately has a very difficult time doing. And so in our final evaluation of the theory, we're going to say that we're missing some stuff. If God gives us commands, we can get consistency out of that. We can see that it works from case to case to case, and we can get definite answers. So we pass these two criteria. Many people believe that there's something intuitive or very natural about religion and about the connection between, if it exists, between religion and morality. So it may fit certain ideas of intuitive appeal as well. The theory also has internal support. We can't deny that. The power lies in that the Euthyphro dilemma ends up causing difficulties with explanation of why something is right or wrong, good or bad. Again, it's a question about normativity. Where do I place the moral force? Is it in the command or is it in the action? And if that's the case, then I can't explain actually why something is right or wrong, good or bad. The theory also fails with regards to external support. That is, the theory doesn't end up giving us a lot of robustness because it ends up contradicting, to some extent, a lot of basic religious tenets, a lot of things that people believe are powerful about religion. Now, this version of divine command theory that we talked about today is a very general form. In your article by Robert Merrithew Adams, A Modified Divine Command Theory, what we see is Adams proceed to try to change his conception of God, of the theory, that is, to allow these things to work. Now, whether or not his project is successful or not is up to question. And we see, for example, in Wes Morrison's rebuttal, we see that there are problems with regards to how we conceive of divine commands. Wes Morrison points out that the nature of a command, the nature of religious comprehension, and of presumably the availability of commands to non-believers may be problematic. Morrison thinks that it's hard to comprehend that people who don't believe in God are supposed to receive these commands. And if they do, how would they recognize it? They wouldn't have any context for the command. And therefore, they wouldn't recognize it as a command. They may see it as something different. What Wes Morrison gives us instead is his conception of the divine will, that there's certain kind of moral directions or inclinations that are instilled with us, regardless of commands. And that non-believers, therefore, can understand the intentions of God, whereas they couldn't with a divine command, because they couldn't recognize the command itself. The theory is not perfect, not by any means. And it ends up weakening the strength of conceptions of divine commands. But it may be more tenable than what we see from Adams. continue to think about your conceptions of the connection between morality and religion. Morality and religion. Do these things make sense? Do you think there's a connection? If so, tell us a little bit about it. If not, tell us a little bit why you don't think that's the case.